Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to Sustainable Outlook. I'm Elizabeth Crouse, a partner and co-lead of the global power practice at K&L Gates. In this episode, I interview Holly Christie, who is General Counsel at Hecate Energy, a developer, owner, and operator of renewable energy and storage facilities in the United States. Holly, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. You mentioned to me once that one of the reasons why you work in renewables is because it allows for the democratization of energy. What did you mean? Why is it important to you that that's the case?
So I have kind of a circuitous route that I took to get to be in this career. And when I was in my post-undergrad career, I was in a very successful corporate America job and working in an office, and I had my little suits, and I was like, all right, I've got some money. I get to buy my groceries without worrying about the price of avocados, things like that. But I realized that there was this lack. I was like, how am I helping the world? The world seems like, we're on the skids in a lot of ways. And it seems important that whatever I do, it has to kind of assist with this larger concept of being this global population of people. So went to law school with the idea of working in international humanitarian law, because once you start kind of trying to ask yourself, how do I do good? You have to break down that question to what is good? And I know that's close to the UCC question of what are goods, but it's a difficult question. Those are both difficult questions to answer. And at some point I just decided, all right, definitively genocide, pretty bad. We can all agree nobody likes genocide. So I decided to go into that out of law school. But ultimately, in working in developing nations, what I saw was, even with regard to civil conflict and genocide conflict and things of this nature, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of structural problems, right? But in developing nations, there's such a need for very, very basic things. And one of those things is energy, because it's really this switch that kind of turns on so much more. If you just have access to a small amount of energy, your cooking becomes far more sustainable, your access to communication, your access to potential educational tools, it just really dramatically changes how everything works. And energy, although everything around energy is very politicized, the actual thing that is energy isn't politicized itself. So it's just this service, this good that I was like, wow, this is super important into bringing everybody kind of up to the same level where they can at least have a fighting chance to kind of evolve and create the societies that they want to create. So that's how I ended up stepping over into energy from humanitarian genocide law.
It sounds a little circuitous, but also makes a lot of sense. What's interesting to me about what you said is that, you've focused on international humanitarian law. And I think for a long time, we've thought about energy as something that helps really, really squalid, poor communities who don't have access to anything. Is it just an issue for less developed countries? Is it just an issue for places who've experienced, extreme environmental disasters, Puerto Rico, for example? Is it something that is more down the street?
Energy is this uniquely, awesomely global issue, and environmental justice around energy is the most kind of intertwined with all of us as like a race, as a human race, right? So I think a lot of people talk about developing nations and energy because it's this clean potential slate, right? You have these non-structural integrations, right? So like in America, right, when we talk about energy, we have difficulties of structure because of the grid and how it exists. And so we have this infrastructure that we have to work around necessarily. If you go down to Tanzania, they don't have as much of a grid that you have to work around. So you can kind of take very, very new concepts, microgrids or, kind of remote solar sources and say, hey, if we had the opportunity to recreate energy as a resource, on a blank slate, what would that look like? And I think places like Puerto Rico and Haiti and stuff like that, when you get the slate proverbially wiped clean in some ways because of natural disasters, you have that opportunity as well. So it's a big kind of flashy thing to look at. But ultimately, what interests me so much about environmental justice and how energy kind of plays into that is like, ultimately, you have the developing countries that kind of live around the equatorial band globally, right? And you see a lot of issues with regard to farming, to agricultural, that bleed over into politics, that bleed over into civil conflict, that then become immigration issues. And all of those populations are moving up into the developing world, or the developed world in Europe and in the States. And then that's causing great strife here. And what nobody seems to be very good at linking back together is it all comes from the same source, right? It all comes from climate change, and it's only going to get substantially worse. So either we're going to solve this as a group, as a human race, or we're not going to solve it at all. You can't take it piecemeal and say, hey, Germany's doing great, with their renewable energy, and they're doing great with their, efforts toward climate change. That's not going to be enough. It has to be a global solution.
Hecate has done a project with the Hickory Apache not too long ago. I mean, is that an example of the democratization effect? Is that climate change again?
So I think that's one of the great opportunities of renewable energy. So renewable energy and specifically solar energy, which is what Hecate's kind of working with the Hickory down there in New Mexico desert, is you have oil and gas resources that are naturally tied to certain kinds of infrastructure structures. But we can come out and we can say, hey, we are willing and able to work with populations that haven't necessarily looked at energy resources in the past. And so working with the Hickory to set up the first renewable energy solar project and the first energy project on that tribal land was a really, really cool opportunity. And it just came from being willing to be a bit more creative and think a bit more outside of the box. And then also kind of understand that the negotiation process, the contracting process wouldn't look like, it does in every other scenario or situation if you're working with kind of an off-taker or a specific landowner who's just a private person. So I think renewable energy, because it's such a new industry, it still has a bit of that like teeth in it, like people are like, ooh, I want to be really creative and I want to do crazy stuff. And we're not yet trained that like, this is the contract we use for this. And then after this, we use this contract. And then we put these things in the ground and then this comes out and we pump it over here. And this is what it looks like. Like we get to kind of define how this works contractually and legally speaking. And that allows us to partner with folks that haven't been able to tap those resources before, because for sure it is a different process to work with a tribal group than it is to work with anybody else in the United States. So
I think what you're saying is that it allows for the creation of something new, or allows for access to something different because you are willing to think outside the box.
That's right. A beautiful way to put it.
You mentioned that Hecate largely focuses on solar. I think you all have some storage also, right?
You do, yep. So we do solar plus storage, and then we have a sister affiliate that just does storage, standalone storage projects.
Okay. Both of those technologies are something that's gotten a lot of attention lately about sort of human rights issues in the supply chain. Of course, we all know there's been a lot of scrutiny of silicon lately in solar, but storage gets a little bit of it too. And I think some people are worried about sort of a looming crisis in respect of environmental justice in the storage supply chain. Should we be shunning solar because of the situation in Xinjiang, or shunning storage because we're worried about toxic chemicals in groundwater and so forth?
I mean, it's funny when people ask that question to me, because it feels very much like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because for sure, other sources of energy that are not renewable, shall we say, have long had, human rights issues and supply chain issues that are touching on these same kinds of questions. And I find it very interesting that those conversations have kind of grown stale or quiet. But so they're rehashing this in the direction towards solar and the renewable energy sphere. So does that mean that it shouldn't be an issue to us? Not at all. I think it's a huge issue to us. And I think the opportunity is that whereas with fossil fuels, they were very behind the eight ball. So fossil fuels kind of came up and we developed all this. And only later were people like, wait a second, does this like hurt people? Are we like using processes or products that, kind of in the long run are causing these larger humanitarian issues? And then they had to correct. Whereas with the renewable energy industry, like we're still quite new. So asking these questions this early in the development of what we are, we have the opportunity to really say like, okay, what can we do from the get-go or from the very, especially for battery storage, like that's a very, very new industry. So we can say, what can we do? We know there's going to be issues because we know we use these particular materials that are rare, that are only found in developing nations. And that is naturally going to cause issues with human rights. Like it's like, if you think we can just go into Congo and like pick up a pound of butter and it's going to work out, like it's not so easy. So what can we do? And what has been shown historically in other industries to be really effective with limiting those effects for humanitarian crises like slave labor and child labor and proper use of minerals that are conflict minerals and things like that. So that's, I think, the opportunity of everybody kind of directing, hey, what's going on with human rights and the production of solar panels and battery storage chemicals. So I think it would be immature of us not to consider that question and say, okay, how can we get way ahead of this 8-ball and fix the problem before it's even a problem?
I think that's a really good observation. But on the other hand, isn't it kind of difficult to do that and run a business?
Yeah, this is why I got out of human rights law. It's like it's really hard to fix these problems, right? Like these are global, big problems that are multinational, and you tie in a bunch of cultural issues as well. And I think you and I have talked before about there's some different approaches. There's like the big approach of like, oh, we're going to write all these policies and it's going to be elegant and we're going to have all of this scroll work and we're going to say these things about we really don't like slave labor and we really like children. But what's the efficacy of that? You know, is that actually doing anything? And how much money are you spending on that? So as a small to medium size company, and a lot of renewable companies are a bit smaller, a bit startup size, like you have to say, where can you get the bang for the buck? And then convince people that that bang is worth that buck. And I think that's the analysis that's really tricky. And I think the thing that people should start thinking about more, because a lot of kind of consultant groups or bigger firms or things like that, if you approach them and you say, I have this problem, you know, I want to make sure that we're doing what we can do to stay out of problems and to stay out of issues with these supply chain, you know, human rights issues. Mm-hmm. They're going to write you this like 17-page, like these are all the things you should do, and you should never talk with these people, and you should always run these reports and investigations. And like, you know, that's you're already talking about $20,000 in legal fees just to come up with that policy, let alone like something that is going to hinder you from being really flexible and moving really fast in an industry that demands that. So I think it's up to the kind of executive group and the legal group to start thinking really creatively and saying, okay, how can we not slap the same sticker on everything and saying like, this is the policy, we've said the policy, we've said the words, and now we don't have to think about this. Or we've put together this thing that's very costly that like is going to hinder the business altogether. But what can we do that's actually going to create thoughtful change that might actually help something? So, for example, I know in Hecate, we've been talking a lot more about integration of terms and conditions in supply contracts, especially with international suppliers of equipment and supplies services that, you know, kind of have attestations within the contracts regarding human rights and the sourcing of certain minerals and supplies and stuff like that. It's not a lot. Is it going to actually, you know, change somebody's mind when they're like, maybe we won't do this with slave labor? Like, no, not when we just do it. But I think as we continue to push the ball forward, kind of as a consumer community, that it will eventually create more and more change, and it will show interest to policymakers with regard to like political groups that are also trying to affect change in this area. And I think all of that together has to be the solution. I don't think one person's policy on contracts is ever going to be enough to move the needle.
So it's interesting that you talk about supply chain that way. I think one of the questions that I'm encountering quite a bit in the marketplace right now is, you know, how far do we push these policies? How far do we push these terms and conditions? And who's doing the pushing, right? You know, you said that it really takes sort of the effort of a group of people in order to create change. well, there's always a question about who's going to be the first mover. I think one, and then there's a little bit more complication here, right? Because renewable energy has different players in it, right? Some of those players are people who are utilities who need to buy power in order to service their customers. It's their main line of business. Other people, like some of the big corporates, right? It's not their main line of business. Renewable energy is something that they're doing for a lot of different reasons, but it's not the widgets that they sell or their services they provide. What are you seeing out in the marketplace as far as where are the requirements coming from? Are they the utilities? Are they the corporates? Is it something that you're just doing internally because you think it's the right thing to do, or you think that the storm is coming, shall we say?
That's a great way to put that. But like the positive storm, shall we say, the good storm. So yeah, I'd say that what has been motivating our push and our thought to like really put some of these policies into a more concrete functionality place is that for the first time ever in my career, I'm seeing requests, even in the RFP process, for proof of descriptions of our policies on supply chain ethical issues and anti-slave labor and human rights and all that kind of fun stuff. So for the first time, we're being asked at very early onset, like, how are you guys taking this? What are the mechanisms that you're using to like make sure that this is working? It's preliminarily kind of coming up. So you see a lot of those larger corporations that we're talking about that are, BPPA off-takers, and they're looking to satisfy their own consumer base. So you've got these folks are buying widgets, but for the first time, these consumers, my mom at home in Idaho is like, yeah, but why is so much packing material being used? And like, are they using green energy? And how is this working? And I think those larger companies are trying to they're seeing that, they're seeing where it's going, they're seeing the writing on the wall, and they're saying, hey, before this even becomes an issue, let's go ahead and create the supply chain for us of the future. And if we're going to do that, we need to integrate all this other folks. So they're pushing the expectations of their consumers back to us. And then in turn, we'll take that and turn that into policies with regard to the next step in that supply chain of like, hey, where are we getting the resources to create the clean energy so that we can make sure that this is as clean down the entire supply chain as it can be, at least at this point. And again, right now, there's not a ton of teeth to a lot of these provisions. There's not like hard requirements of, this has to come here from this. You have to make sure that these provisions are in the contracts, because I think we're all figuring this out together. Like what works really well to actually create change, what works well to appease your customer base that you are doing things as green as possibly, and how do you implement that kind of down this tranche of people that you don't necessarily have a whole lot of control over. So I think we'll continue to see a lot of development around how that works. And from a personal perspective, renewable energy companies that are, kind of our mid-size and smaller, I think it behooves them, and it's really, really smart to get ahead of that bus and say, great, like let's go ahead and see what policy we can put into place that will give us the highest level of, kind of thoughtfulness and care around this, and kind of, appease everybody, and they'll be like, wow, they're doing this great. But at the same time, it offers us the largest amount of flexibility to continue to contract and work with those folks that we need to in order to get a hold of the equipment and the supplies and the workers that we need to put this all together on the time frame that we have to put it together on.
Makes a lot of sense. Have you observed anything that's working, fairly well in order to try to make some of these changes further down the supply chain?
So one of the things that we're integrating, I think we've talked before about making sure that we have the requirements for attestations in our contracts so that our equipment suppliers are at least attesting that, to their knowledge, we're not using kind of forced labor or slave labor, that to their knowledge, the supply chain for the questionable minerals are as clean as possible. So we're asking them to at least make that promise, as far as they can make it. We're also more than ever before kind of keeping track of what's going on with, hey, what are conflict minerals? That definition changes from time to time. What are going to be the up and coming issues that we may not have now, but may in the future? So, a lot of sourcing has shifted out of China into other countries, but we've also seen those non-circumvent cases create big potential issues. So seeing those issues and saying, okay, if that's not a way to work around, what's another way that we can source stuff? What's coming online with regard to the efforts to create and to build more of these products in America? And can we partner with some of those folks? And how is that working? So I think it's just being not reactive, but proactive and saying, okay, we know this is going to be an issue. It's never going to stop being an issue which is good, that our consumer base is asking, hey, can we get this any cleaner? Can we get this, so that it doesn't touch any kind of humanitarian crisis? And I think that's a great thing as a country, as a population, as a consumer, for people to be asking. I'm glad that they're asking that, even if it does cause more heartache for me as a lawyer in this company.
Holly, your comments have been really great so far, and I really like how you're providing really sort of practical comments. Those are really useful. We've talked about supply chain. We've talked about how renewable energy can itself be a democratizing force. How else does sustainability come up for an operating business? Renewable energy is already green, that hits the environmental aspect of ESG. And we've talked a little bit about some of the social, but you're still a company at the end of the day. How else can you approach some of these, for example, social aspects of sustainability as an operating company?
That's a great question. And I think there is a very, very delicate balance between working with a company and a company's clean goals of always making money and making money for the shareholders and being profitable at the end of the day and continuing to be, a successful company. And then also that driving force of being somebody that wants to work in a renewable energy company and what that means for future generations, et cetera, et cetera. I think that one of the things I love about working for a renewable energy company is you get a lot of folks, a lot of young folks, but a lot of folks that are like really driven by passion for this area and this topic. And they're really creative when they're thinking about it. They're riding around on their bikes and like, how can we do this better? And they're, at home talking to their friends about this. And it's one of those resources that if as a company, you're not plumbing that resource, like you're really missing out, So if you go out and you talk to your developers, if you talk to the guys that are running the math models and stuff like this, and you're saying like, what else would be cool to do? It's amazing what they come back out with. So there's a school here in Chicago, and it's a school in an underprivileged neighborhood that is run on 100% renewable energy. So they're produce 105% of their own energy. They grow a lot of their own food. They have a curriculum that teaches kindergartners up through what they goal to be middle school and high schoolers, the main curriculum that all those kids learn, but also with a sustainable slant. So teaching them about renewable energy sources and stuff like this. And so I had never heard of this school. And one of my developers was like, hey, we should go and talk to the kids. And so we ended up liaising with the school. We're going to help them with some placement of solar panels, but just going out and being able to share what we do as a company with these kids. And they were like really, really interested because they've been talking and hearing about solar power and what that means and how that works. But now you actually see people that are like building solar plants and what do they really look like? And what are solar panels made out of? And like, how does energy get from my cell phone, from the wall? And they had all these really interesting questions. And honestly, that was one of many things that we've kind of participated in based on, somebody's random idea that I was like, wow, I really feel like this is making a difference because it's just educating this whole younger generation and putting the seed of thought of, hey, this is how this energy works. This is how it could work. Like, this is a job you could have. You can be a girl and you can go do just as much cool stuff with renewable energy as you could if you're a boy. And just being able to interact in that way with that group was really, really cool, especially since it was in one of our underprivileged neighborhoods that doesn't get as much economic benefit. And you can see the effects of like what's going on with kind of renewable energy, environmental injustice kind of stuff there. So that was brought to us by one of our developers. So.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. Well, Holly, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your comments. Thanks so much for withstanding the interview process.
You've made it very easy. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you in the audience for joining us today for this discussion with Holly Christie, who's GC at Hecate Energy, which is a developer, owner, and operator of renewable energy and storage facilities here in the U.S. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, Subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.